The Night Watch, one of the most famous Dutch paintings from the 17th century, painted by Rembrandt van Rijn in 1642. An art historian could probably tell you a lot more about the painting's lighting and composition, but I thought it would be interesting to look at this painting as a 17th century Dutch reenactor and what details from the painting stand out to me. In general, the painting depicts an Amsterdam militia company under the command of Captain Frans Banning-Kok and Lieutenant Willem van Ruitenburg. The company belongs to the Kelvermans Guild, or Kloveniersgilde in Dutch. A caliver, or in Dutch called roer or clover, is a lower caliber firearm than a musket. When we compare the Night's Watch with other guild portraits from the time period, we'll see that the other guild portraits are a lot more static. Within the Night Watch, there's a lot of movements, and most of the subjects don't look at the viewer. And now we're going to look a bit closer at what the painting actually depicts. Let's start with the captain dressed in black. He's wearing a gorget under his ruff. He's also carrying a sword. It's hard to determine what kind of sword. It could be a fantasy sword or a pillow sword. He's also carrying a rattan, a walking stick that also denotes his status. Now we're moving on to the lieutenant. He's the only one in the painting who's wearing riding boots. He's also wearing very ornate stockings that are laced to his breeches. We sometimes also see this with soldiers in the period. In his left hand, he's holding a very ornate and very nubbly partisan, as a sign of his office as a lieutenant. He's wearing gloves that are either fur-lined or trimmed. His jerkin features the coat of arms of Amsterdam, and around his neck he has a high-closing gorget that's heavily lined or padded. On the far left stands the sergeant, Reinier Engelen. His helmet is most likely fantasy. He's also holding a halberd as a sign of his office as a sergeant. The shape of the halberd is not characteristic for the period, and is also probably highly likely a fantasy made up by Rembrandt. He's also wearing a breast and backplate, and what looks like mitts and gauntlets on his hands. Next to him, we have Jan Pieterszoon Bronkhorst with a 16th century style morion helmet. He's also carrying a broad-bladed basket-hilted sword. First, I thought he was the rondassier of the company, but according to the Rijksmuseum, that's the guy next to him, which is the first of two rondassiers or rotellamen, Hendrik Jacobsen Wormskerk, carrying a round or oval shield that has the same rivets as the morion helmet next to it, and the shield looks to have a lining or an edge trim. The girl is depicted as an allegorical symbol for the Kelvermans Guild. On her waist belt, she's wearing objects that symbolize the guild. For instance, a bullet pouch, a pistol, and a rooster with its claws pointed up in the air. Her dress doesn't represent clothing from the time, which further cements the idea that she's meant to be allegorical. Next to the girl stands a faceless man who's also thought to be an allegorical symbol for the guild. He's wearing 16th century clothes, and he's firing his musket slightly upwards. He's also wearing a 16th century morion helmet, decorated with oak leaves, which symbolize honor and heroism. And he also has a very nice dagger and powder horn. There are 5 calivermen depicted, one on the far right with his caliver on his shoulder, the second on the far left, Albert Willemsen, depicted with a plumed fantasy helmet and also wearing his caliver on his shoulder. The third, Dan van der Heijden, pouring powder down the barrel of his caliver. Notice his fur-lined or trimmed bandolier with relatively long cords going down to the powder charges. The knees of his breeches are slashed. Some think that his clothing are a 17th century attempt at 16th century clothing. Personally, I don't really think that's the case, because the allegorical man behind the captain is wearing clothing that are much more representative of the 16th century. Speaking of the allegorical man, he is the 4th man actually armed with a caliver, and he is firing it up in the air behind the head of the lieutenant. And the 5th is Jan Klaassen Leidekkers. He's wearing a fantasy helmet and blowing out the pan of his caliver. And only 3 of the 5 depicted calivermen are depicted with musket rests. Traditionally, flag bearers or ensigns were single men. This is visible on guild portraits by their brightly colored clothing, amongst all of the other guild members who are wearing black and most likely are married, since the fashion in this area and time dictated that married men from a certain social standing were black, and that single men from the same social standing would wear more brightly colored clothing. And the name of the ensign in the Night's Watch is Jan Visser Cornelissen. Some historians believe that this is a sneaky self-portrait of Rembrandt. The second ronde zie je Klaas van Kruisbergen, is depicted here as the bodyguard of the ensign. He's wearing a very heavily padded fantasy helmet, a metal shield, a gorget, and a very broad-bladed sword. The first pikeman is Jan Okkersen, depicted here with a hat instead of a helmet, but with a back and breastplate, possibly a gorget and spolders. This is Jan Allemansend Re-enactment, depicted here as Captain of Arms. He is responsible for the weapons belonging to the guild. To represent this, he carries a greatsword, and he wears a slashed Landsknecht inspired beret. The second pikeman is Wolk Schellinghout, depicted with a heavily plumed ornate fantasy helmet. He's also wearing a gorget, and he has the best depiction of a pike in the whole painting, with the point of the pike clearly visible. The third pikeman, Barend Hermansen Bolhamer, is wearing a hat instead of a helmet, and you really can't see anything of his clothing or if he's wearing armor or not. The second sergeant, Rombout Kemp, is wearing clothing of a slightly earlier period, mostly represented by the stiff rough collar around his neck. He's holding a halberd that's a little bit more typical for the period compared to the first halberd held by the other sergeant. The fourth pikeman is wearing a fantasy helmet and a gorget. The drummer, Jacob Jorissen, is depicted here with a slashed beret, and on his forearm we can see a heavily slashed sleeve. These are 16th century elements, and most likely there to symbolize the honor and valor of a bygone age. At the feet of the drummer there's a dog depicted in a strange pose, most likely to represent that the dog got startled by a sudden beating of the drum. The figure in the bottom left is holding a powder horn and wearing a helmet that's much more typical for the time period. Within the context of the painting, he represents a powder boy or powder monkey. It's his task whenever a cavalryman runs out of black powder to refill the powder charges he's wearing on his bandolier. The halberd and helmets I refer to as fantasy are most likely created by the mind of Rembrandt. If you would like to call them parade helmets, you're welcome to do so by me. But there's no proof that guilds in Amsterdam or anywhere else use parade helmets like these. And it's this use of fantasy and allegory that make reenactors skeptical when it comes to the work of Rembrandt compared to genre painters like Jan Niels Molenaar or Adriaan Brouwer. If you have any questions or anything to add, please leave it in the comments. Also, if you would like to see more of this kind of video or less of these kind of videos, also leave it in the comments. I hope you liked this video, and now we're going to look at a spinning coin.